everyone. I'm Brian Bates, and I trust Google Maps without questioning it.
West on.
I'm Linda DeYoung, and I unironically use the Kahoot music at parties.
And this is the One-to-One podcast, brought to you by the Learning Technology Center. Ask Linda, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing great. Here we are in 2025. You're listening to this in the brand new year. So thinking about New Year's, how excited are you to make like a New Year's resolution? You like those?
I have very mixed feelings about New Year's resolutions. I don't know about you. Sometimes I feel like they're really great and they can put you on course for goals for the year. And then sometimes I feel like they are ones that you maybe just make because you feel obligated to. You know, we all have those like basic New Year's resolutions that everyone commits to: drinking more water, being more active, you know. And I feel like sometimes people
Yeah.
make those just because they feel like they have to, you know.
Oh, absolutely. It's like if I don't make these resolutions, if I don't put these things down on paper, they're not going to come true. I'm not going to do them. And I can honestly tell you, I don't think there's been a single time that I have made a resolution where looking at the end of the year, I could look back and say, you know what? I did that. I actually did that. You do it for maybe a month, maybe two if you're lucky. I hope there's people out there listening going, yeah, right. I do resolutions every year and I always follow through with them, but I just can't. So it's just something that I'm not good at following through with resolutions. But there is something we could do that's a little bit more kind of my speed. Have you ever heard of an anti-resolution?
I feel like I've heard a little bit about them, but why don't you tell me what an anti-resolution is?
So this is why I say it's a little bit more my speed. I say I instead of committing to do something for the year, an anti-resolution, just the opposite of that. We're gonna find something that we're gonna commit to not doing.
Hmm. I like
So
that.
yeah, so I think that it's less of adding things to your plate and more maybe taking them off your plate.
Hmm.
So let's think about this for a second. Let's make an anti-resolution. If you're going to make an anti-resolution, something you were going to commit to not doing over the
Hmm.
next year, what would you do?
That's a great question. So my anti-resolution is actually based on a resolution that I have made every year for a long time, probably since like 2015. And this resolution that I make, a commitment with myself I make every year, is to read a certain number of books. And for any listeners out there who are Goodreads users, I'm a huge Goodreads girl. They make it very easy to commit to this resolution because they have a reading challenge every year where you can set your number of books that you want to read and then you track them on Goodreads. You put what books you're reading and what books you want to read, and then you rate them and it goes into your tracker. And so it's like that instant gratification of, oh, I'm watching my tracker fill up on Goodreads. My problem is that for the last like 4 or 5 years now, I have set the very ambitious goal of 35 books. And I am a huge reader. I have met high goals in the past. I read 30 books one year, but 35 I have not met for the past few years. And especially now that I'm working on painting more, getting into the studio more, I feel like this goal is no longer serving me. It's just making me feel bad about myself when I only read like 15 books every year. So, my anti resolution is to not set a reading goal of 35 books. I'll probably go lower, or maybe I won't even set a goal at all, and I'll just be very rebellious this year.
It'll be really interesting to see what happens at the end of the year. Like, so, okay, listeners, you got to follow along now until December of 2025 to find out. And we'll have to put like a little mark in here to remind ourselves. But it'd be interesting to see what the difference would be with a lower goal or maybe even no goal at all. Like without the pressure, does that change how you read?
Mm.
And does that maybe even get closer to that goal than you think without having the pressure of that number on it? That's a really interesting idea, is to take away that number and just not shoot for that huge number anymore and go for something that's more realistic to allow you to explore those other creative outlets that you're talking about.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I'll surprise myself, you know, like maybe the goal is just making me feel bad, and if I don't focus on it, then I'll just be reading a lot more than I ever expected. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Please, yes, tune in for the next year and we'll come back and I'll be like, here's how many books I read. But Brian, what about you? What's your anti-resolution for 2025?
So I know when I've done resolutions in the past, I've always set like a goal to start doing a different activity or a hobby, or I want to start doing this more. I want to start, or I want to maybe get better at a certain hobby or activity. And I feel like I always put that pressure on myself to start doing something and doing more and more. And what I've found is, as I've gotten older and I have a young daughter and a family
Mhm.
and other obligations, it's harder to spread yourself out among all these different hobbies.
Mhm.
And I think it kind of goes a little bit with like what you're saying is that by maybe reducing the number of books you read, that can allow you some extra time to go into those other creative areas. And so for me, instead of like adding a new hobby to my list of things that I want to do, instead of going down that rabbit hole, like let's narrow down and like let's stop doing so many things. I love cooking, and I've always have I every year I have a goal of learning new techniques and getting better at
Mm.
cooking more often and things like that. I love avid fisherman, so I love going out and going fishing. Same with like home brewing. I do that a lot, and as you just continue to add more and more activities or hobbies or things like that, to do them and do them well, and then continue to add, it takes up a lot of time, probably a lot more money than I'd like to admit to. So like this year, I really want to focus on just finding those, going to those hobbies that I really love to do and I get a lot of enjoyment out of, and really focusing on those instead of trying to branch out and start new things. Like, whether it's a new activity. Last year, I picked up pickleball and started
Mhm.
playing that a ton. And, there's nothing wrong with doing new activities, but I find myself spreading myself so thin over all those different ones. And like, I want to be good at this and I want to try more of this, that I don't have the time to. And then I get frustrated and look back at the end of the year and I'm like, I didn't really do anything different. I didn't really get better at this, or I didn't go fishing more often, or I didn't, learn any new techniques in the kitchen. So, really focusing more on the hobbies I already have and less on adding more. I think that's going to be my anti-resolution.
I think that's great. I am a big proponent of the idea that saying no is actually saying yes to other things.
Yeah.
And so sometimes saying no is necessary. And for our people listening, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'd love for you to type in the comments what's your anti resolution for this year. I'm sure that lots of you have already made resolutions, but we'd love to hear what you are going to stop doing this year or what you do not want to commit to. Um, but getting on to today's episode, maybe your school's New Year's resolution might be improving its cybersecurity. And if so, this month on the podcast, we're exploring the day the internet died, a firsthand account of a tech director's experience with a real world security attack at their school. Are you ready to get in, Brian?
Yeah, let's go for it. We're joined today by our first guest, Emily Flach, the LTC's very own Regional Education Technology Coordinator for the Southern Region. Prior to coming to the LTC in August, she was the tech director at Effingham Unit 40 and a high school teacher at Newton Community High School. While at Effingham, the district was hit with ransomware in February of 2023. As educational organizations continue to be prime targets for cyber attacks, she hopes that by sharing her experiences, districts can be more prepared to deal with these types of threats. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm excited to share our not so great situation.
We're so excited to have you on. I think that this will be a treat for our listeners because you have that firsthand experience of what this was like to be in a school during a cyber attack. But before we get into our interview today, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So Brian mentioned a little bit about my background in education, but I'm also a mom to two boys who are 7 and 5. So most of my time deals with chasing them around and spending time with my husband and our family on our little 10-acre plot out in the country. And so working with LTC gives me the chance to really dive into ed tech and talk to different districts. And that's what I love to do. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
That's great. So, usually with our podcast, we like to start with a little game to get to know our listener or our interviewer just a little bit better. So, I'd like to play a game with you today called Finish the Sentence. It's a very creative name. Basically, I will read the beginning of a sentence and you will fill in the rest. For example, my favorite color is, and you might say red. So, what do you think? Do you want to give it a shot?
Sure, let's give it a shot.
Perfect. So the first question is a movie I just cannot bring myself to like is blank.
Oh, Lord of the Rings.
Oh, my husband would be so sad.
Yeah, my husband's very sad about it as well, but I just can't watch it. Can't do it.
That's totally fair. The ed tech tool I can't live without is
Currently Canva. Canva is my go-to for lots of things right now.
if I could go back in time, I would tell my first year teacher self to blank.
Focus on the students. The rest of that stuff is minor. Just work on building relationships with students.
Absolutely.
I agree. The best way to spend a sunny day is
At the lake on a boat.
It's good.
Brian loves the lake.
I do.
It's one of my favorite
And
places. Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, if I weren't in education, I'd probably be
Oh, that's a hard one. Maybe physical therapist, because that's what I originally went to school for. And then I switched to education. And sometimes I'm like, should I have stayed, outside of education? So yeah, probably physical therapist.
and that's it. With that, the gauntlet is done.
All right,
You successfully achieved finish the sentence.
All right. Very good. Fun game.
That I tell you, I thought when Linda asked a movie I just cannot bring myself to like is I thought that would be like really, really hard. And I was like thinking to myself, and I'm like, oh yeah, that actually would be pretty easy to answer. There's a lot of them out there. So I guess let's just dive right in. Like, let's just go straight to the point here on this one. When you were
Sure.
tech director, your district had a cybersecurity incident. So can you kind of describe the moment that you first realized there was a security incident in your district, and what were those initial signs? What was it that gave it away that something's wrong here?
Sure. Well, it was about 6:15 in the morning. I got a call from my superintendent that one of our elementary buildings didn't have internet or phones. This
Mhm.
person goes in early to line up the subs for the day, that kind of thing. And since I was not the brains of the technology infrastructure, so I was more of like the person who managed the tech department, and I was more on like the instructional tech side. I called my network specialist to have him look into the incident. And really, like in the IT world, I feel like the network being down is really, it could be a result of a lot of different things.
Mhm.
So I assumed like maybe it's a bad switch, maybe it's an issue with our provider. We had some bad weather the night before. So initially I wasn't like super concerned because we even had some connectivity issues in that building on occasion. But then my network specialist got back to me after he looked into it. And he said, actually, he texted me back. He said, we've been hacked. It's bad. Somehow it got the servers and we are in trouble. So that's how I initially first found it out. So I got those text messages and I'm like, what? So I called him, we talked through a few things. And then I got to have, I got to call my superintendent to break the news to him. He was actually at a community breakfast. And so I was like, yeah, you're going to have to leave and you're going to have to meet me at the district office to figure out what the next steps are going to be. Let's just say it was not a very good start to the day.
Oh, I imagine that sounds like a bad way to start the day.
Yeah, the absolute pit in my stomach that would develop when I get the text, we've been hacked, it's bad. I can't even imagine like the anxiety that would produce in like everybody involved, everyone who's like the first responder on that incident.
Mhm.
So we hear about corporate security and data breaches in the news all the time. Like I'm sure we've all gotten those letters in the mail that's like you're entitled to a payout. But what was it like to be the person on the inside of a security attack? And maybe what were you feeling and or thinking at the time that it happened?
Yeah, it was actually really surreal. I had attended so many cyber attack, ransomware presentations just to like kind of be prepped prior to us being hit. But nothing can really prepare you for that moment when it happens to you. There's that feeling of fear, like you're mentioning, Linda, that loss of control, that paranoia, just essentially like a lot of worry of, did I do something to trigger this to happen? That thought, like, did I cause this? I think ran through just about everybody in our organization's head, but especially my IT staff. We were all like, you have to tell me if it was me. You have to tell me. Like, we were all very, very worried. And, I knew about the dark web, I knew about ransomware, but through our interactions with the FBI and our cyber forensic company and other security professionals, I kind of got that peek behind the curtain of organized cybercrime. And it's not just computer nerds in their basement, which it can be sometimes, but it's like businesses in groups, like cybercrime gangs in other parts of the world that have a group of employees that are hired to inflict chaos in people's organizations. And in some cases, they're actually selling ransomware as like a service. Like, here's a package, we'll show you how to initiate it, that kind of thing. And then schools, of course, become a target because they don't typically have the funds for people or this high-end software or equipment to deal with these highly complex attacks. And these bad actors, they want children's data, which is scary, but
Yeah.
their data can be sold on the dark web and used for years before it's discovered. And
Wow.
so, hearing about this stuff is one thing, but then to be living through it with your own data and your organization's data is another. And, I wasn't a trained IT professional. I just told you I wasn't the brains of the network infrastructure. I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. So my eyes were really open through lots of pieces of this whole incident. And I was super blessed to have worked with an amazing and supportive leadership, board, and IT team, because no one was trying to point the finger and figure out like who caused this. It was more of like, how do we figure out what's going on? How do we create solutions to get out of this mess? And I think that's an extremely important perspective to have in a situation like this.
Yeah, I'm really curious because you had mentioned before that, like, something's not right. You make a call, you get some background info, and you get that text message that says, this is not good. You call your superintendent and say, here's what's going on. So what did you do at that point? Because like, I'm sure there's a lot of panic, a lot of chaos. What were those immediate steps that you and the rest of your team took once you kind of realized what was going on and once you knew that things were really bad?
Right. I mean, we had, a typical ransomware note on one of the servers. It was in Notepad or something like that. So based on those initial findings by my network specialist, like, we knew it was a cyber attack. We just weren't sure how bad it was in that moment and that, at 6 o'clock in the morning. Once we brought everybody together, so like our district leadership team came together. So that was me, the superintendent, curriculum director, and special services director. Like, the first thing that we did, I mean, I know we're talking network and cybersecurity, but the first thing that we discussed was, are our students in buildings safe?
Mhm.
In the major reason for that is another district about 45 minutes down the road was actually having like a physical security threat. And so we were worried or, considering like, is this part of a larger, more complex threat? And this is just a piece of it. And so you have to do that in these types of emergency situations. And while we didn't have door access control of our buildings, so people, we can't mess with scanning in and out. And the doors were locked. I want to make sure people realize that the doors were locked. Our students were locked and safe, but we didn't have security camera footage either. You have to remember we live in an Internet of Things where all aspects of an operation are tied to and rely on a network connection. And so
Yeah.
we have, everything was either locked or frozen in its current state: HVAC, door access control, security cameras, and that kind of stuff. So after we deemed our students safe, also from a district leadership, perspective, we called another district that was about an hour away because we knew they had dealt with ransomware a few years back. We actually got their presentation slides and printed those off, and that became our cyber incident response plan, like their PowerPoint slides, which I don't recommend to anyone. Like, have your own cyber incident response plan ready.
Yeah.
We also didn't have cyber insurance, so we didn't have them to call to ask for next steps. And so it's really important that, you get those things moving. Don't delay, because they were on our list of to-do things. We just didn't get them done. And, cyber criminals, they just don't wait until you're ready. So we did call a cyber forensic company to consult and investigate. We also called the local PD, the FBI. I actually did reach out to Eric Muckensturm from the LTC during all of this, and then our legal, of course, to be ready on standby, essentially, for all these things we're about to get into. From the IT side, they were just trying to determine what we had access to, backups and firewall logs, combing through anything and everything to give us more information. And then, of course, disconnecting the network. And, getting the right information from the right people is so important in any emergency situation. And that held true for this as well. I mentioned to you, we had pictures of that ransomware message. And so we were able to try to start researching that even before the cyber forensic company arrived on scene to start pulling machines for their data analytics and investigation.
Wow. That's a lot of moving parts. And, I do appreciate that you point out that, the physical security of the building was like one of those top priorities, because you don't think about that. But as you point out, so much of our buildings and our infrastructure is connected to the network that
Mhm.
should something go down, that is a potential possibility. So I think that's a great thing to also consider.
Mhm. And it's also obviously unfortunate that we live in a time where, these things can become like multiple attacks, where it's not just one building that's being attacked, but
Mhm.
it is like multiple buildings, multiple organizations that are all being attacked at the same time. And so I can understand how scary it would be that there was another district or another building close by you that was experiencing like a physical breach. Like, oh my goodness, is this all just one big attack that we're dealing with now? And
Right.
how terrifying that would be.
Right. Because even just like
Yeah.
a few months ago, there was like some kind of TikTok trend or something where kids were calling into schools. And again, you just don't know the
Mhm.
magnitude of some of these threats. So,
Well, thanks for going over kind of what you did in the moment to mitigate that attack. I'm also interested to hear what some of the immediate concerns and challenges that you faced after the incident, once you had confirmed it, once you had started with those first steps. What were those things that you had to address afterwards?
we've already discussed, but just that everything, and not just in education, but, when you go to your doctor's office, when you go into a bank, everybody uses everything that's now connected to an internet connection. So not having a network, that was the major challenge. So breaking the news to our teachers that they had to teach without technology. And before the critics say anything, yes, teachers can teach without technology. We can do it. We have done it. But
Confirmed.
our teachers were absolute rock stars because it did require them to shift their day-to-day functioning. We didn't have student devices. We take attendance through a student information system. We take grades and lunch counts, and we don't have chalkboards anymore. We have interactive displays and digital learning platforms. Your basic word processing, everything is, that daily workflow for teachers and
Mhm.
students, that workflow is just disrupted.
Mhm.
And it was interesting because it was a contrast to the times of COVID where everything just like whoosh, we're pushing digital. Everything has to be online and
Yeah.
digital. It's now the opposite. We're back in the dark ages with no technology for teaching. And so I was really most amazed by our teachers. They were creative. Most of them didn't complain. We had to tell them no a lot. Can we do this? Can we do that? They were trying to come up with creative solutions, and we're like, no, we have to keep like a secure situation, and we can't be adding these other little pieces to it that we can't control. And so they were incredibly supportive to our IT staff, which I think is absolutely crucial during times of crisis. Another challenge I want to mention is that when we went through all this, we were coached by our cyber forensic company and our legal to call the attack a network issue. And so that's
Mm.
what was pushed out to the public and all of that. Because district leadership and IT staff, we were also under a non-disclosure agreement. So we couldn't discuss a lot of what was going on. And I know this frustrated like the staff and the community because people were putting two and two together. Okay. People realized that we were having a cyber attack of some kind. People were online stating, like, why don't they just tell us that they've been hit with a cyber attack and that kind of thing. But at the time, we couldn't publicly state it for a variety of reasons. That NDA, the investigation was still ongoing. And then this was another little piece that I didn't know about, but we were also told by our cyber forensic company that you do not want to draw attention to your situation or your district in case your hackers are watching local news. Because if you're drawing more attention, that could increase your ransom. And at that time, we were considering our options, which included possibly having to pay a ransom.
So I'm curious, and I'm sure listeners are too, what exactly was your ransom amount, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, it's funny you ask because that is a question everybody wants to know. And unfortunately, I don't know, we never actually found out how much that ransom amount was going to be. This cyber forensic company said to expect it to start at 1 to 2 million. And that's a pretty typical coverage amount by cyber insurances. But also thinking about asking a school district with limited public funds to pay that kind of amount is kind of crazy. But this cyber forensic company, they had like a ransom negotiator on standby in case we needed to get to that point. And they said they could possibly get it down to like 30 to 50,000. So anywhere from 30,000 to 2 million, somewhere in there. I'll also add in there that finding a bank that can deal in Bitcoin can be difficult in the central southern Illinois part of the state. So another thing to keep in mind. But
You
thankfully,
mean you can't just like write a check and mail it to the hackers? No,
you
they don't
can't.
accept checks. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
They didn't want the GameStop stocks?
yeah. They didn't want it in gift cards, Amazon gift cards.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Dang.
So thankfully, we were able to get our data back in kind of an unconventional way. So we never had to negotiate a ransom, but that is a question we get often. So
Sure.
So, like, as you sit here and our listeners are hearing this story and kind of thinking to themselves, man, I don't want to go through something like this. But
Mhm.
we know it's becoming more and more frequent with education these days. Let's say that they have a similar experience. What advice would you give to anyone listening to help prepare for uh, and or respond to a potential security attack or incident, network incident?
Sure. Yeah, network incident. Make sure you say that right. It's not a breach.
Yeah.
It's not ransomware. It's, a network situation.
Yeah.
So to help prevent this from happening, multi-factor authentication, MFA,
Mhm.
I hear of so many districts that delay this because it's inconvenient, and it is
Oh, yeah.
slightly inconvenient. And this wasn't our case, but I hear oftentimes the hurdle is that teachers unions are against it because they are being asked to use their own phones for authentication. And there are ways around this so that teachers don't have to use their personal phones. You can use security keys or codes. And my advice is rip off that Band-Aid and just do it. You need MFA. It's a simple and effective layer of protection. And in the sophisticated digital age that we live in, it's an absolute necessity. And then the other big thing I would say is cybersecurity training. Another question that people ask a lot is how did they get into our system? The bad actors actually entered our system in November. So months before they actually launched the attack in February. And this is actually pretty common. It's usually around the holidays is what we learned is when they typically infiltrate. And so even with that cyber forensic company, we never found out how it entered into our system. We do have our suspicions, of course, very similar to others who have been in our situation. It's likely that someone clicked on an email and interacted with some kind of malicious attachment or provided their username and password, and then the hacker was able to escalate privileges within our system. That really happens in it's like 90% of cyber attacks. But exploited vulnerabilities in unpatched software and systems, such as through HVAC or printers, could have also been the culprit. So again, anything connected to your network presents an opportunity for hackers to exploit. And because of that, segmentation of your network is very important so that you can protect those crucial systems and kind of lessen that impact. And again, cybersecurity training, your human firewall is your greatest vulnerability. It takes one person and one click. So train and educate and educate. If you can create a culture of secure practices, that's the best that you can do.
Yeah, so you can tell teachers, hey, if you don't want to go back to teaching with a chalkboard, use that multi-factor authentication. Use cybersecurity practices, learn about it so you don't have to go back and do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's mind-boggling to me to think that something as simple as like a printer that's hooked up to the network, which feels like all of our devices at this point are hooked up to the network in some way, shape, or form, Bluetooth or otherwise. And It's wild to think that even a printer can be a way that someone gets into your system and then
Mhm.
gets access to all your data.
Right. In school systems, a lot of times it's HVAC systems. So,
Mhm. So, to kind of wrap up your experience with us today, I wanted to ask, after you've gone through this experience, how has it changed your perspective on cybersecurity and education?
oh gosh, I can't even really begin to explain the way that this experience has changed my perspective on life, but cybersecurity and education. I'll really just kind of leave it at this. Like, we are the keepers and the gatekeepers to a lot of student data,
Mhm.
and we hold and control who actually gets access to that data. So whether it's a digital platform, digital textbook, or it's yearbook or Jostens or whoever that you're sending all this data to, it's completely our responsibility to try and defend and fortify those gates that's, securing their data. And, you can't completely prevent a cyber attack, but you can invest in software and equipment, and more importantly, investing in your people and training to make sure that your district and then therefore your students are more secure in the digital world that we live in. So,
Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. That was kind of equal parts insightful and terrifying, but we really do appreciate you sharing your experience and what you did to get through it. And hopefully, someone else listening to this will learn from this, and it'll help prevent or at least help guide them through an incident.
yes, Brian and Linda, thank you guys for having me. It's not my favorite topic to talk about, but if someone can learn something or can be more prepared for this type of incident, then it's worth it.
We're joined as well by Eric Muckensturm, the LTC's IT Strategy Manager for Cybersecurity. Eric provides a multitude of services to help Illinois school districts improve their security standards. Welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Eric, welcome. We're excited to have you a part of this episode. Why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit more about yourself and the work you do?
Sure. So, as Linda said, I am the IT Strategy Manager for Cybersecurity at the Learning Technology Center. And what that means is I do cybersecurity assessments, professional development, and webinars and general consulting for all the school districts in Illinois.
Awesome. Well, we just finished talking with Emily about her personal experience with a security incident in her district. However, cybersecurity attacks, as you know, are changing all the time. And so I'd love to hear, what are the most common cybersecurity threats that schools are facing today, and how maybe are they evolving as well as time goes on?
That's a good question. So schools are facing a growing list of cybersecurity threats. Ransomware, phishing, and data breaches are the most common. Ransomware attacks really surged. Schools are seen as easy targets with limited resources, and that often leads to double extortion, which means attackers both encrypt the data and then they also threaten to leak the sensitive information. Um, Phishing campaigns have become much more sophisticated. They are very legit nowadays. They're often using AI to convince to create convincing emails. It'll trick the staff and the students into sharing their credentials or installing malware. Um, these threats are evolving, and attackers are exploiting weak passwords, unpatched systems, misconfigured cloud services, and schools are also vulnerable to DDoS attacks that can take a network down in mere moments. So, addressing these challenges requires proactive measures like regular staff training, implementing multi-factor authentication, and adopting a zero trust policy. As they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I just got a text message yesterday from the USPS Postal Service saying that my address on file wasn't correct. And of course, the link that they send is phishing for my information, but it looks very legitimate.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so,
A big one that's all over the place in the United States, and but a big one here in Illinois in the past few months, I would say in the past at least 6 months, was the toll booth
Oh, yeah.
phishing scam as well. We were all getting those.
Yeah, that one almost got me. And I had to, like, I actually like was texting my wife about it, and I was like, "Come on, like, what did you not have your transponder out? What was going on here?" And yeah, then I saw the news article. So those they're very convincing, and like
Yeah.
you can do everything you know, you just have to be very, very aware of what could potentially happen and be overly cautious. Like you were talking about, the ounce of prevention. It there have been times where I've emailed you or other staff members before and be like, "Hey, I got this. Is this legit?" And then you guys generally respond like, "No, that's not." Okay, it looks real. So
Yeah.
you know, you'd mentioned just a few of the different things that the schools can do to protect themselves. But like, what are some of those key things and key steps? Um, those preventative measures that schools can have or can put in place to develop a comprehensive cybersecurity plan.
So, starting with a thorough inventory process and a risk assessment would be the first place you want to go. That will help you identify critical assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. From there, I would say you should establish just clear policies around data access, password management, and acceptable use. Then you need, of course, layered security measures like firewalls, antivirus software. Multi-factor authentication is definitely essential, and you want to make sure you're patching regularly and doing your updates to keep the systems protected. Equally important is education, training staff and students to recognize phishing attempts and following best practices. That's one of your best defenses. Schools also need to back up their data regularly and test those backups on a regular basis to ensure they work in an emergency. Um, a solid incident response plan and monitoring tools will ensure that any breaches are detected and handled swiftly. And an incident response plan is something that everyone should have. And if you don't have it, you should at least be starting it and work with um, all the different people around you to share resources and information to build that plan and protect yourself as much as possible.
Yeah, it sounds like it takes a lot. I feel like there are a number of things that have to be in place in order to keep secure. It's not just a pinpoint one or two things. It sounds like this is a really comprehensive plan, and sounds like it takes everybody.
It really does. It's not just a one person thing. It's not just the IT staff anymore at all. You have to have everybody on board, and that starts from the top: the superintendent, the principal, the board of education. You have to have everybody involved, and then that trickles down into the teachers and the staff and the students. Even though we safeguard the student access to the network and access to students' email addresses pretty heavily, it's still something that they're going to need to recognize. They need to work on their data privacy as much as possible.
So you mentioned, Eric, that a part of this is really effectively training staff. So if I'm an administrator or part of the tech department in a school, what exactly are those effective training practices versus maybe practices that aren't as effective at training staff?
you know, Training staff and students on cybersecurity best practices starts with making the material practical, engaging, and easy to understand. You got to start by explaining the why behind cybersecurity, how a
Mhm,
single mistake like clicking a phishing link can lead to significant consequences for the entire school.
mhm.
You got to use real world examples or stories to make it relatable and memorable. For staff, I would say you got to provide regular training sessions on topics like recognizing phishing emails and using strong passwords. You got to keep it ongoing as well. It's not going to be a one and done kind of thing. These cyber threats evolve, and so you need to come up with weekly or monthly tips, annual refreshers, and you need to create a culture where questions are welcomed. Um, and so that everyone stays informed and vigilant. It's not going to be a one and done kind of thing. This is a dynamic process where everyone needs to be involved in it and constantly learn.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely feels like, one of those things where we talk about technology is always evolving and always changing. You have to continue to stay up on it. I mean, it sounds like this is the same thing too. Cybersecurity threats are constantly evolving, constantly changing, and so, what you talked about the year before is not the same as what's going to happen the next year with the next phishing campaign or the next way that they're going to go after data. So I do appreciate the idea of continuing to go back to it and making it a point that it's an ever evolving thing, and you have to continue to be on top of it.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point. With the phishing campaigns coming up different all the time. When we do phishing campaigns for school districts, the templates that we use, we try and mix it up all the time so that it's not the same thing over and over.
Mhm.
And you'd be surprised that even with how many people go through training, they still often fall for these phishing campaigns because they look so real, and they're making it much more personal as well. So it
Mhm.
could be an email that comes to you and says, it could have the superintendent's name saying, the superintendent is sharing a file with you. Please open this file and do something with it. And as soon as you click on it, then it may say, well, you need to log in to be able to access it. And then boom, you're entering your credentials, and that's getting
Yeah.
sent right to the attackers.
That's yeah, that's something that would be very difficult to decipher between real and fake until it's too late. So
Yes,
Mhm.
it is. And one click's all it takes. It's
yeah.
it's literally just the one time thing. When I do these phishing campaigns for school districts, I keep track of how many um, how many people are clicking, and try and come up with a percentage. And last year I tested over 11,000 teachers and staff, and it
Wow.
was about a 6% what I call failure rate. And that means people clicking on a link inside of an email. And 6% doesn't sound bad, but when you realize it just takes one click, literally one click to bring down a network, 6% is still way too much.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, Linda and I like to start our podcast. We talk a lot about how technology is viewed in pop culture, and we talked a little bit about we've talked a little bit about hacking and things like that. And I think you think about the that person that's in the basement, the dark basement hacking, and that movies always portray. So it got us kind of thinking about, like, what are some common misconceptions about cybersecurity, and probably maybe more importantly, school cybersecurity. um, what are some misconceptions out there about school cybersecurity, and how can we address those misconceptions, or the things that aren't necessarily a real problem?
Yeah. So for some reason, one of the most common misconceptions is that schools are not a valuable target for cyber attacks.
Mm.
People think that hackers are only going after the big corporations or government entities, and that schools are, kind of off limits. But schools have a treasure trove of sensitive data, student records, staff information, financial details, and that's very, very lucrative for attackers. Um,
Mhm.
so, I mean, to address this, schools need to recognize they have vulnerabilities, and they need to prioritize cybersecurity just as much as the larger organizations do. Um, Again, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. Another myth is that cybersecurity is purely an IT responsibility, and it's just not anymore. Obviously, IT teams play a crucial role in protecting the school systems, but it takes a collective effort from staff, students, and even parents too. You got to build that culture of cybersecurity awareness, where everyone understands that they have a role in protecting data. Um, and that's, you know, when they understand that, that's kind of a key to overcoming the misconception.
Mhm.
Um, Regular training, open communication about threats can help bridge that gap as well. Um, some schools think that they can't afford robust security measures. The truth is, many best practices kind of like enabling multi-factor authentication, updating software, educating users. That's low cost or free. And it's highly effective. Any school can take those steps. So that's something they need to start off with immediately. It's not about having the biggest budget. It's about being proactive with the resources that you have. And with all that though, you also have to realize that you're never going to be 100% protected. It's just not possible. That does not exist. There's always going to be a risk, but through a risk assessment that you would do, along with right at the beginning, along with doing your inventory, you have to decide what your acceptable level of risk is, and then use that as a roadmap on where to dedicate your time and resources.
Yeah, and if someone is looking to make those first steps towards, becoming more secure, what types of resources or services does the LTC, does your team offer to support schools as they're getting started in their cybersecurity efforts?
So right off the bat, I would start with a cybersecurity assessment and a network assessment. They're two different things, but what we can do is either come to the district or do it over even a Zoom meeting where we can go over on a cybersecurity assessment. We'll go over something like 40, 45 different categories and ask a ton of questions where we can say, kind of go through your cybersecurity posture and say, this is what you have, this is what we've observed, and then this is what we recommend. And we can do that on the same thing for the network side as well. We do a ton of different webinars, professional development, and just general consulting as well. So you can ask us anything. We can help do trainings for your staff. We can do mentor programs as well. There's plenty of services that we can help you out with.
So if our listeners are, maybe they're sitting there going, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that, this is bigger than I thought it was," and we need to get moving on this. How can they get in touch with you or the LTC to learn more about those cybersecurity solutions and services?
Well, the easiest way is just to go to our website. It's www.ltcillinois.org. All of our information is on there. There's a page specifically for cybersecurity. There's a page for tech services, which is my department. And you can get our email addresses from there, or you could just send a message to the support email as well.
Awesome. Well, Eric, before we wrap up, one of the things we like to kind of end our podcast with are like a challenge. We're gonna we have like a scenario. We give you the scenario, give you a little bit of time to think about it, and then you kind of give your response, your ideas, what you would do in that situation. Is that something you think you'd be up for doing today?
Yeah, let's try it. I'm excited.
Okay. So I'll give you the challenge, then we'll give you a little bit of time to think it through, and then you'll give it. And while Eric's thinking it through, listeners, think about yourself, your situation. How would you go about responding to this situation? So, all right, we ready?
Ready.
All right. Here's the challenge. A school administrator discovers that their personal device, which they occasionally use for schoolwork, has been hacked. Sensitive school emails, files, and personal information are at risk. The administrator is unsure how to proceed and is worried about future incidents. How would you help this administrator mitigate the damage and secure their device and data? What immediate steps and long-term strategies would you suggest? Let's give you a moment to think about that one. All right. Well, Eric, what are your thoughts? What would you say?
I think the very first thing you're going to do, if the device is, let's say a laptop, a personal laptop, and they brought it in, you have a bring your own device policy, and it's on the school network. The first thing you're going to do is get it off the network immediately, so that it doesn't, any malware doesn't traverse the network. And then you can go into the laptop, you can shut off services, any necessary services. I would say the first thing you're going to do is, of course, the second thing after taking it off the network, the second thing you would do is to run some antivirus program on there. That's something that should be on there already. If not, then obviously they're going to have to install something, and hopefully it's not too late. Hopefully the device isn't locked down to where you can't install some kind of malware protection program. Endpoint device and recovery programs are vital, and I would definitely get something like that on there immediately as a long-term strategy. It should be on there already, but if you're going to secure any kind of files, you want to make sure that you have a backup of those files so that in case it does get locked down or they disappear, you can back that up. But immediately change passwords as well. Any password. If there's a connection into the network as well from a personal device, it should be on a VPN. So make sure you get a VPN installed also. But if it's already been hacked, the first thing you're going to do is take it off the network. The second thing is to run all the malware all the malware software you can.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for playing our challenge and also for joining us today on the podcast to talk through what the LTC can support schools with, as well as just some really important information about cybersecurity and how schools can keep their data safe and their networks safe from potential attacks. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. Well, on top of all the resources that Eric shared, the LTC also hosts a full day of cybersecurity strategies, tools, and best practices at our Secured Schools virtual conference. Join us online January 28th. Registration is still open.
And do you want to stay in the know about new podcast episodes? Consider following or subscribing to the One-to-One podcast.
All right, Linda, see you next time where we'll be sitting down one-to-one.